Hello and welcome back to Essentially Explained, the fourth podcast here on the channel. Yet again, I'm joined by Mr. Dan Marks as my co-host. Dan, how are you doing?
Well, yeah, again, am I like a burden now? Oh, it's got to drag this guy along. For God's sake, he's going to replace me any day.
Yes, yeah, we've still put the job applications out, but we're yet
Yeah, I
to
was going
get
to
an
say
interviews.
maybe you'll pay the next person a bit more.
We're paying you nothing, so it's pretty easy
Yeah,
to do.
I told you I'm under his floorboards. He only takes me out once a week.
Yeah, we'll once a week we'll wheel him out for this, and then besides that.
Will me out. You make me sound like I'm Prince Philip.
Anyway, before we deviate too far away into the royals, and because we could have a whole podcast about that
Good
today.
podcast idea.
Today we're going
We
to be
should do one.
talking about Keynesian versus NeoClassical economics. Basically, just sort of discussing the positives and sort of negatives of each, and I think we can both see there's a number of flaws with both, but both have their merits.
Wouldn't be economics if there wasn't.
Yeah, like any model. I think we both agree that models sort of vary in terms of how applicable they are to the real world, right?
I mean, vary in the sense that they're all wrong. Yeah, how
Mm,
wrong they are is what varies.
No, I think the majority of them are right to a certain degree. I think Keynesian and neoclassical
Yeah,
can
I
be.
think. Yeah, I think neoclassical is just pure wrong. Like it is just wrong. And Keynesian's more out of date. I think that's the problem. Really.
I wouldn't say neoclassical is necessarily wrong. I think there is merit behind it. Uh,
Yeah, it really just goes down to political alignment, really, isn't it? It is all what you believe in, isn't it? Your politics, your view, worldview, I guess. Um, yeah.
yeah, so I think, obviously a neoclassical economist would argue that essentially your AD is always temporary, but your sort of long run aggregate supply, well, obviously they aim to increase long run aggregate supply to increase your sort of long run growth, which
Yeah.
could um, you could argue for. Increasing AD as a government can be inefficient for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I think it also depends on what you do, what part of AD you look at increasing. I mean, yeah, Keynesian economics in particular takes more of the viewpoint that government should act as a stimulus, whereas the neoclassical side of economics will say any increase in AD, really, any like stimulus, any, as we would say, a stimulus package, which is something that government always likes to shout about during a recession, will just lead into hyperinflationary pressure. Well, not hyperinflationary, but certainly inflationary pressure. Because factors of production are pretty much fixed. You can't get past your long run aggregate supply for very long. In the short term, yes, you can deviate from it. You can go beyond it for a short amount of time, but it will always self-correct because in the long run, the factors of production are more fixed, and so you just end up with inflationary pressure.
Yes, yeah. The basic concept is that any benefit you get from growth is outweighed by inflation. So in real terms, you have a negative growth essentially, right?
Yeah. You'll have a positive output gap, which is where your AD can shift, for example, to the right, and then that can go beyond your long run aggregate supply. For a short time, your YFE, your full employment, your full output point. It is possible to do that in a very short run, but obviously it's never sustainable because, for example, if you put it's like the government, for example, launched a brand new radical, I don't know, employment um, scheme where they aim for 100% full employment. They got people. There was something called boondoggling in the 20s during the financial crash of the 30s, the Wall Street crash, and so they were paying people very low wages to do simple jobs like picking up litter. Okay, in the short run, yeah, that will work. That will get people in employment, spending money, but it's costly. It's inefficient, and so in the long run, it's not sustainable. So yeah, you'll always result back to your YFE.
Yes, I mean, Actually, I'm just going to return to the Great Depression and the financial crash
Yeah,
of
yeah, very
29.
relevant.
It's very applicable to neoclassical, actually. It sort of points out perhaps the flaws. Now, of course,
Yeah, it does.
one could argue that, well, the Second World War was the true sort of, I guess you could say, saviour for the American economy, a sort of the final step for recovery from the Great Depression. However, data does show that input, government sort of input under FDR did have some impact. Unemployment, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
decreased
frankly.
from 24% to about 12.5, 13% by the end of the New Deal, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, actually, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression is actually probably more applicable to Keynesian economics. In all honesty, it was where it resulted from. Essentially, the components of aggregate demand, GDP, just consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Governments had no way of actually measuring how the economy was actually doing on a macro level. There was no GDP figure in that time. It wasn't really sort of like if you like, a standard figure or a standard measurement that was used. So they actually commissioned in the US a team of economists to actually find a measurement of how the economy was doing generally. It's because of the Great Depression. That's where GDP came from. And then you see a lot of the measures that, as you say, Franklin D. Roosevelt actually sort of sparked the birth of Keynesian economics. And Keynes, in particular, was pretty instrumental in a lot of the reforms in the UK from the 40s to the 50s. After the Second World War, you see a lot of things like the NHS being born, a lot of government spending in things like social infrastructure and welfare contributions that were pretty much inspired by what Keynes said. And Martin's going to take you through what Keynes said right now.
Well, I wasn't expecting that question. I actually was going to return to a previous
Yeah,
point,
go for it,
actually
Martin.
to expand on
Explain
a
to the
previous
world.
point about why I said it was neoclassical. Essentially, what I should have done is expand on that. So, Herbert Hoover was the
Oh,
one who would have used essentially neoclassical, where he sort of took a very sort of right-leaning approach on the sort of market managing side of things. So there's a sort of having a laissez-faire approach in terms of
that's
not
the word.
having
Yeah,
a lot of government influence,
that
whilst
word was
FDR,
coming, wasn't
yeah, it took a couple attempts.
it?
Whilst FDR took a more Keynesian approach in terms of government influence, in terms of investments.
Yeah.
That's why I was saying that sort of showcases why perhaps neoclassical doesn't really work.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was the Great Depression really actually revealed the flaw in neoclassical and classical economics. The idea that the economy will just self-correct, particularly in a time of deep economic recession, as the Great Depression was, is just complete rubbish. If general demand for consumer confidence is so poor that it won't recover by itself, then suppliers, as the neoclassical model would assume, will not. Why would they expand output? They've got no incentive to. If there's no point, expanding their output and taking on more workers if there just isn't a demand to meet that. And so, yeah, you need government intervention to get people spending, and then suppliers have the incentive to actually expand their output and generate growth.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just return to the question you asked me before I went off back on the American topic. You were asking
Yeah,
about Keynes, right?
yeah. Just explain it really to people.
That's the whole theory, or just a basic
Yeah,
outline of the theory?
go for it. Yeah, yeah, you go for it. I've sort of done neoclassical. Do you want to take the Keynesian route? The good
Yes.
old
I
well,
mean,
modern economics.
it's quite difficult to explain without a graph, but essentially the idea with Keynesian economics is that you can achieve long run growth by boosting aggregate demand, which is completely opposite to what neoclassical is. So essentially, you have a sort of curved demand uh, demand curve, right? No,
Not demand.
no, sorry, supply. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember it, picture it in my head. It's quite difficult to do.
Yeah,
But yes, so essentially the idea is that you can sort of shift AD, well, hopefully up, but AD can be shifted up and down along your aggregate supply curve, essentially, and that this sort of boost in AD can be permanent. It's long run. You don't return back to sort of an initial a point like you do with neoclassical, where you sort of have a short-term boost and it returns to the original point. With Keynesian, it's more sustainable. You don't necessarily have to boost your factors of production to achieve economic growth, right?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, Keynesian economics, what it's about is you don't have, unlike neoclassical economics, you have in classical economics, you have short run, long run aggregate supply and an AD curve. Keynesian economics essentially incorporates short and long run into one exponential curve where you have three different sections. It's just long run aggregate supply, and you have essentially the starting point within a neoclassical model assumes that the economy is at a negative output gap. If you imagine an exponential curve, you have, obviously the flat bit to begin with, the bit where it starts to increase, the what we call the unitary elastic section, where an increase in output will result in an equal increase in average price level. And then you have the almost perfectly inelastic bit, the bit that's going exponential and rising up, is where you essentially get no further growth, but it's inflationary. Now, what the Keynesian model assumes is that you're you're operating on what's called a negative output gap. And what that means is we talked about what YFE means, the full employment point, where you are employing all your resources in the economy. And that is the bit where it starts to head exponential on the right-hand side of that long-run aggregate supply curve. And in the Keynesian model, it assumes that you're operating before that. So your AD curve is further along the left of that long-run aggregate supply curve. So you've got a negative output gap, and you need something to shift that AD curve along. And because to begin with, it's flat, what that means is you can achieve more growth along your real GDP axis, the x-axis, the horizontal one, without much increase in your average price level, very little inflationary pressure. But the difference is that it does still accept that if you take it beyond a certain level, if stimulus package shifts AD so much, there will still be inflationary pressure in the further long term. There's still a perfectly inelastic or a completely straight vertical part of the curve where any extra stimulus will not increase GDP, because obviously you've only got so much in an economy, and you just get inflationary pressure.
Yeah, I mean, we'll add a picture of both graphs in post editing.
I think we'll do a little video on each model actually. Maybe I'll do one, you do the other, just to demonstrate, so you can listen to this, and maybe we'll just add a diagram, as we're talking through it, so maybe you can follow along as I'm talking about it. It's harder without the graphs, but it's a big debate in economics, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we just start going off about ADAS, and the people listening are just like, what are they all going on about?
Oh yeah, we should probably explain what they are.
Yeah.
If you're not aware. Okay, Ryan, you do your favoured one out of two. Go on.
So I will talk about aggregate demand. So essentially, aggregate demand. I'll try and keep this brief. Consists of government investment. You then have exports minus imports. You also have consumption, and then you have investment. So investment from whether that be basically from businesses, essentially, and you basically add those all up, and that's your AD.
Yeah. So in a basic macro model, you have, in the Keynesian one, which is probably the easier one to explain the two, really. You have two main curves, two main lines. You have aggregate demand, as Mike just explained, which all it is it's the aggregated, i.e. sum, all the combined total of all level of demand in an economy. And it includes obviously standard demand like consumption, which is consumer goods, people just buying things on an all day-to-day basis. Investment is another part of aggregate demand, like the equation, and that's people like, for example, investment in infrastructure. One example is China, and a lot of companies have invested in the UK in a power station called Hinkley Point, and the new reactor there. It could be things like investing in railways. That's investment. It can be foreign direct investment, which Martin loves. But also another component of aggregate demand is government spending, which is basically what the Keynesian model says is the key part to getting out of recession. And net exports, which is just your exports, and then subtracted. You subtract your level of imports from that. That's all the aggregate demand is. Yeah. And then supply. Shall I do supply?
You can go for it. Why not?
Yeah. So should we go both short run and long run, I guess?
Yeah, I guess that will be the best way of explaining it.
Yeah, so you have your short run aggregate supply. It depends what model you use. If we use the neoclassical model for a second, they both have a short run aggregate supply and a long run aggregate supply. Short run is almost like the opposite of an aggregate demand curve. An aggregate demand curve, like in microeconomics, is sloping downwards. So it's a negative correlation, if that helps you think about it. As the price increases, demand is going to fall. It works the other way around for aggregate supply and supply in general. If the price level is increasing, suppliers have more motivation to increase output. So it's a positive correlation curve, if you like. So that's just your normal sort of like X equilibrium where the two curves meet. And then you also have a long run aggregate supply in the NeoClassical model, which is what's called perfectly inelastic or vertical, 100% straight. It doesn't increase, the quantity doesn't increase at all. And the reason that is because you only have so many factors of production, so the ones we've discussed already in the economy, and you can't go beyond that. There's only so much you can produce in an economy. If you think of a PPF diagram, if any of you have heard of that, a frontier diagram, there's only so much land in the world, isn't there? So you can only build so much, and that's what that is.
That was actually a really good explanation, I must say.
Thank you, teacher.
It's basically my new name. But essentially, just to pick up, if anyone doesn't know what PPF diagram is, essentially it's just.
I think I'll do one.
Sorry.
I think I'll do one actually in my next micro video. I think that might be a good idea. We'll go over that.
Yeah. I mean, just as sort of as a brief thing, basically, as Dan alluded to, it just shows essentially the possible production level of an economy based on its factors of production, like land, capital, people, or labour, as it's officially called. But as Dan said here, we'll do another sort of video, sort of doing a deep dive on that. Just to sort of move on to the next thing, going back to sort of Keynesian versus NeoClassical. I thought it'd be a good idea to have a look at some common criticisms of Keynesian economics, and then we can have a look at the common criticisms of NeoClassical. See whether we agree.
Evaluation question.
Yeah, whether we agree or disagree, essentially. So, point one. This is from economicshelp.org, just as a source if anyone wants to have a read.
Good referencing, like you're citing there. Good.
So, point one is borrowing causes higher interest rates and financial crowding out. Keynesian economics advocated increasing a budget deficit in a recession. However, it is argued this causes crowding out. For a government to borrow more, the interest rate on bonds rises. With higher interest rates, this discourages investment by the private sector.
It's quite a lot in one statement there, isn't it? You have to go. I mean, this is Martin's favourite topic, so I think he's going to be quite keen to explain this one. Go for it.
Yeah, so we'll sort of try and break it down because it's quite a chunky point. So it is true that Keynesian economics, you could argue, sort of advocates for high government borrowing. Now, in itself, high government borrowing is not necessarily a bad thing. Basically most economies, if not all economies, I think most economies. I think there are some economies that do run a surplus for some strange reason. But most economies will run a budget deficit, essentially because that helps their economy, because that means they can provide more sort of services to the people living within that country. But borrowing's fine as long as you don't go overboard like Greece did, which has sort of led to them having problems further down the line. But yes, also you could argue that, and I do sort of get this argument that it can lead to crowding out of private enterprise. If obviously the government is providing so many services and goods, then there's not that opportunity for private firms, whether that be domestic or international, to provide those same goods and services perhaps more efficiently, because governments are known to be rather inefficient with their spending. Dan, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you explained that pretty well. The only, in a very basic sense, where this relates to what we're discussing is, as Martin said, Keynesian economics. The main idea is that during a recession or deep economic downturn, which is obviously the context for which it was built to talk about the Great Depression, government spending is the main way to jumpstart the economy, get people spending by employing or spending money on things, and then that feeds down through the circle of income. And the main way they fund that is through what's called government bonds. We've talked about them before a little bit. borrowing, and that leads to what's called a crowding out effect, where essentially on the financial markets, government bonds start to crowd out all the other different securities, and because obviously interest rates are so low, it can disincentivize some other people taking out investments in bonds, in securities, and instead go for government bonds, and so the private sector suffers. So there's always a counter argument. But I think I don't know if that's as relevant in today's world, if I'm being honest. I would contend that because you have what's called QE, which is quantitative easing, which is something I'm sure Martin's going to cover in his macro videos at some point. And in very simple ways, it's just a way that central banks can get money moving around the economy by just printing it. It's as simple as that, really, but in a slightly more diverse way. And they can use that to buy bonds in the first place and take over the role of that instead of the private sector. So I'm not sure it's quite as relevant today, but it's still a relevant point. The Keynesian model doesn't really explain the drawbacks. It assumes that once government spends, everyone else is going to spend as well because they're being paid.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually an excellent video idea about quantitative easing. It's a really good topic, I must say. I'm looking forward to do that video. But yes, as Dan said, it's literally just, in short terms, printing money. Obviously, there's more that goes into it than just that. But we'll sort of do a sort of more detailed video on that in the future. We'll do a second point on Keynesian, and then we'll move on to NeoClassical before we finish. So the second point I wanted to take from the same website is Ricardian equivalence. So basically, just to sort of cut down this point, because I know the last point was a bit of a chunky paragraph. Essentially, it basically says that expansionary monetary policy, fiscal policy. Of course, it's fiscal. It's government. What am I doing? But yeah,
people argue they're the same.
Basically, they're saying that expansionary fiscal policy doesn't work because people believe that taxes will rise again in the future. So if you have tax cuts now, people won't spend the extra money they get from, essentially not having to pay that same level of tax because they believe the tax rate will go up in the future anyway. So they'll save it, or they basically won't consume more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point. I wouldn't agree with it so much. That's more of a sort of almost like a behavioural point, isn't it? Really, it's the expectation that if a government borrows today, tomorrow it's going to have to finance that and pay that debt back, so they've got to increase tax. I don't buy it personally. I don't think that's the truth of it. I mean, look at the moment, for example, coronavirus. The government is borrowing huge sums of money, and now we're talking the budget deficits, hundreds of billions just in certain months, or rather than a whole year. It's tripled. I can't remember exactly the figure. We'll have to cite it somewhere. But it's not like the government is going to announce sweeping tax rises tomorrow that are going to suddenly destroy business confidence. I guess it depends on the context in which the government borrows on a day-to-day basis, possibly, but I don't know. I don't think a government is going to rush to increase taxes after just doing a stimulus package, which is just borrowing a load of money. Wouldn't make sense. You expand the economy and then you're immediately taking all the money away. It would destroy business confidence. So I think that's rubbish. Personally, that's my view. I'm sure you probably have a different view.
No, I mean, perhaps there is some logic to the fact that people will believe that taxes will return back to sort of the normal rate, and so they don't want to, go into too high of a consumption thing, sort of high level consumption. If that tax rate does go back up, but I do generally sort of agree with that point. Can't speak English today. But one other thing, which is sort of criticism of both, really, is time. Well, it's more criticism of Keynesian economics because it's more to do with centralised government management of the economy. But time lags. Obviously, it's very difficult to manage an economy accurately using fiscal policy because it takes so long for that fiscal policy to sort of trickle down all the way through the economy, which is a point that I can agree with, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes even longer than monetary policy, I believe, isn't it? It's 12 months for. Generally, people consider 12 months to be the duration of when you can fully see the effects of a monetary expansion. Fiscal, which is obviously to do with tax rates or government spending, can take 12, 18 months, possibly even 2 years, because, of course, the government doesn't work. It doesn't just announce, in normal times, it won't just announce a sweeping tax reform, it will be something that's planned several years in advance and has to be legislated and brought in. So yeah, and obviously they obviously in particular applies to which financial year you're in. So, for example, if we're in this financial year from I believe it's April, was it March? April. I believe it's
April.
April to yeah. So we're in the financial year from this April to next April. So April 2020 to April 2021. If the government announces taxes are going to rise in the next financial year, well, we've still got what 5-6 months from time of recording until that even takes place. That's even just the start of the tax policy, let alone seeing its effects. So yeah, time lag is a problem for anything really.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it takes what, as you said, it's like 18 to 24 months for fiscal policy,
Generally, yeah.
and obviously monetary policy is only a year, which still significant, significant amount of time. The economy can go through many changes within a year. However, yeah, it's obviously a year less or 6 months less than with fiscal policy, and obviously fiscal policy is not always effective because the government doesn't always necessarily know what's best for the people, sort of at the ground level, I guess. But yes, as I alluded to earlier, one final thing before we go, we'll just have a quick look at the sort of weaknesses of neoclassical
Yeah.
economics. Is there anything that sort of stands out to you?
Well, neoclassical economics. I mean, what you're asking for my opinion?
Yes.
Where'd you start? Um, I think the neoclassical is quite a pessimistic view of the economy. It's outdated, certainly. I mean, I said it was just maybe flat out wrong. I always thought neoclassical was more of a supply side policy, sort of rightward leaning sort of view of the economy. It's a view that economists, possibly the likes of maybe Friedman or maybe even Adam Smith, you could argue, would have taken. The fact that the economy is self-correcting is my big problem. Isn't true. Um, I mean, it mostly is self-correcting in the sense that if there's inflationary pressure, it will correct and revert back to the YFE, the full output, which is possibly true because that's even true in the case of Keynesian. Once you get to your YFE, you just get inflationary pressure. But certainly working the other way, where there's a negative, like a downturn, where you've got what's called a negative output gap, because obviously the demand curve can shift left as well as right, even though it doesn't really work the same way for that model. You can have what's called a negative output gap, where your equilibrium is to the left of your full output. So you're actually in recession possibly, or your economy is smaller than it should be. The way it assumes that suppliers might respond, for example, to try and shift that back up. I don't buy you. I don't think it is self-correcting. That's my major contention. What's yours?
I largely agree with you. I don't think either model is entirely accurate. I do sort of lean more towards Keynesian than neoclassical,
Yeah.
because what's the point of government intervention or investment in the economy if it doesn't work? It must work at some level. I think neoclassical economics does have some sort of point. I think you do sort of have a baseline, a long run sort of growth baseline, and sometimes I do agree that aggregate demand to a certain degree is not permanent. It does sort of fluctuate quite a bit. It's a lot more difficult to manage than say aggregate supply because once you have land and capital, whatever you have it. Whilst aggregate demand is dependent on a number of factors. But yeah, I would say it is largely an outdated model for sure. I am in agreement with you on that. I've just noticed the time and that we've overrun a little bit. So
Oh dear, what are we at now?
we are at 28 minutes. So what we'll do is we'll probably do a more in-depth video on Keynesian and neoclassical
Maybe we can do
economics.
a part two. I think might be because I think we're not finished here. I've certainly got some more points that we can look back at.
Yeah. I mean, if you've got anything to sort of add now, then go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the other main big assumptions. I mean, if you look at the assumptions of the neoclassical model, certainly from school perspective, like they teach you at school, you have the rational preferences assumption. So, they assume that. I mean, this is the biggest problem in economics altogether. It's not just the fault of neoclassical. So maybe I'm being a bit harsh here, but they assume that people have rational preferences, so they're going to try and maximize their utility in whatever way they can, and there's a lot of problems with that. Do consumers and suppliers, anyone, any agent, do they have perfect information? No. do they really act rationally in the real world? Do we all act rationally every time? Are we
No.
doing cost-benefit analysis? I'm sure you are, Martin, when you do anything. But he's not a human being. The vast majority of us aren't doing that. We haven't got a spreadsheet out. We're not looking at all the potential costs and benefits, and you can't even account for most anyway. So I think that's the big problem with neoclassical economics as well, not just the actual, the technicalities of the model, but also the assumptions. The assumptions are a problem with any model. I'm being a bit harsh in. The Keynesian model certainly isn't innocent of wrong assumptions either.
Hey, don't have a go at my spreadsheets. They're wonderful.
Honestly, he goes around Curry's PC world with his little spreadsheet going through, look at the production cost, I want to know how much his output is.
I don't actually, just to disclose, I'm not quite that weird.
He does. The sales assistants don't bother him. When you walk into a shop like that, you always get swamped by about 8 sales assistants all wanting commission. You're the one exception to that. They know that they won't get any money out of you. I mean, if we were all rational, we'd probably just sit in a cave, or we wouldn't even bother with life.
Yeah,
it's the truth. It really is.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, that's another topic we can do. Rationality. Whether
I think I'll be looking at behavioural economics a little bit in my micro series. Only a basic covering because it's not something particularly talked about, which is a shame. But yeah, definitely we'll look at that as well.
But yes, as Dan said, we'll probably do a part 2 to this. There's quite a lot to cover, and I'm probably going to go off and do some more research. Sort of brush up.
I think it might be a wise idea. Yeah.
Try and read more in depth, because even though I've done this at A level, I think it's always good to just have a broader understanding. Also, haven't done it in quite a while, so we'll sort of go back to it. But yeah, we'll do a part 2 probably next week or the week after.
Yeah, whatever. I think we might do another video next week and then do something different, and maybe do this video afterwards, the following week, because I think it'd be nice to give a little bit of a different taste. If you've got 2 weeks in a row of the same thing, then yeah. But yeah, I mean, we'll see. There will be a video. We can promise you that much.
Yeah, of course. As always, if you've got any thoughts or disagreements, put them in the comments. Dan, thank you for joining me again.
It's okay. Do I go back into your basement now in a freezer?
Yes, I'll just get the lock and key now.
Oh, great. So for me, basically, my whole life is just economics, and this podcast is all I know. In about a minute, I'm going to be blacking out soon because it'll just be so cold that I just won't remember anything. And then a week later, or instantly for me, I'm just going to be here again, tied up, talking about neoclassical economics.
Well, that turned dark rather quickly, and on that note, goodbye for now.
Goodbye.